Georgetown University campus, much like 27 other Jesuit colleges and universities in the U.S., abounds with student energy and optimism. Less immediately apparent to the casual observer is something all Jesuit universities have in common: a dedication to a brand of Christian commitment to community and service that can be largely traced to one Jesuit priest named Pedro Arrupe. September 13th, 1983. Father Pedro Arrupe makes his last formal appearance as head of the largest and one of the most prominent religious organizations in the Catholic Church. The warm reception he enjoys at his farewell fails to reveal the agonizing turmoil that has led to this day and to the election of his successor. Only those present might note the significance of small details. Kissing the hand of Father Detza, who Pope John Paul II had appointed to replace him 25 months before. The wiping of a tear by Father Vincent O'Keefe, his second in command for 18 years.
My most respected and dear Father Arrupe.
The story of Pedro Arrupe turns out to be of a man whose life is shaped by course-changing events in the history of the world, of the Church, and the Society of Jesus. He was born in the same fiercely independent Basque country of northern Spain that had produced Ignatius Loyola and Francis Xavier more than 4 centuries earlier. Pedro is the youngest of 5 children. His mother dies when he is 10, his father 8 years later. At the early age of 15, he leaves home to enter medical school at the University of Madrid. In his first year, he wins the top prize in anatomy, the first of many awards. He is on his way to finishing medical school in the top tier of his class when he accepts an invitation to visit the Marian Shrine of Lourdes as a member of a commission responsible for attesting or not attesting to the validity of miraculous claims.
For me, Lourdes is a city of miracles. I stayed there for some 3 months. I was thus the witness of 3 miraculous cures from the very moment they took place, in the midst of the faithful who were praying to the Virgin Mary, and then on through the medical verification that was carried out by doctors who were atheists. This impressed me very much, because I had often heard my professors in Madrid, who also were atheists, speak of the superstitions of Lourdes. There was born my vocation.
It is 1927 when Arrupe embraces the secluded life of a Jesuit in training. His studies return him to his Basque homeland in the shadow of the basilica dedicated to Ignatius Loyola. By 1932, Spain is on the brink of civil war. The new Republican government sees the Catholic Church as a cause of many of the very social ills it seeks to cure. The Spanish Republic's new constitution expels all Jesuits from the country. Arrupe joins his fellow seminarians in exile, first in Belgium, then in the Netherlands. After being ordained a priest, he continues his theological and spiritual training in the United States. It is now 1938, at the brink of World War II, when he is unexpectedly assigned to become a missionary in Japan. Already multilingual, Arrupe dives into his study of Japanese and a lifelong mission of intercultural understanding.
I must say that at the time, I did not focus on the transcendent aspect of the missionary experience, but rather on certain negative personal aspects, the discovery of a reality different from what I expected, and above all, the feeling of loneliness. And I experienced an even greater loneliness when I went to Ubi, 21 hours by train from Tokyo, for my first mission assignment, although I spoke Japanese only very poorly. Another important personal event was my imprisonment for 1 month in Yamaguchi. Japan was at war and I was suspected of espionage. I spent days and nights in the December cold, entirely alone. Many were the things I learned during this time: the science of silence, of solitude, of severe and austere poverty, of inner dialogue with the guest of my soul.
When later he was made the director of novices, these were all Japanese with some Koreans, for this Westerner to deal with somebody from a completely different culture was very difficult, but he had made it a point to try to get inside the culture so he could really talk to these people, and he was good at it. In fact, he ended up writing about 6 books in Japanese on the spiritual exercises.
August 6th, 1945 begins as an unremarkable morning for Arrupe and his young Jesuit students on the outskirts of Hiroshima. The hum of an approaching airplane does not seem particularly threatening. They're used to hearing armadas of bombers overhead. Today, there is no siren to raise the level of fear.
So on August the 6th, 1945, when the first atom bomb fell on Hiroshima, Arrupe and his group were just outside the city limits. They heard it, and everything blew apart in the house. They didn't know what it was.
The fate of Father Arrupe and his novices is later filmed for the record by the American government.
A group of Jesuits who were teaching in Hiroshima witnessed and survived the explosion. Between 0 Point and the main building of the novitiate of Jesuits was a hill which served to lessen the intensity of the blast. Yet, despite this protection, the glass in the doors of the main entrance foyer were shattered, and the paneled ceiling was blown loose by the force of the explosion occurring 4 miles away.
Father, would you introduce yourself, please?
In future years, Arrupe would be called upon many times to tell his story, beginning immediately with U.S. newspaper reporters and military investigators.
What were you doing in Hiroshima at the time of the explosion?
Suddenly, we saw a blinding light, like a flash of magnesium. We heard a formidable explosion. After about 15 minutes, we noticed that in the direction of the city, dense smoke arose. We climbed a hill to get a better view. Before us was a decimated Hiroshima.
Father Arrupe, he's been famous for that, for having been one of the witnesses of the falling of the first atomic bomb.
I shall never forget my first sight of what was the result of the atomic bomb. A group of young women 18 to 20 years old clinging to one another as they dragged themselves along the road. On and on they came, a steady procession numbering some 150,000.
Arrupe had a lot of medical experience. He had stopped studying just short of becoming a doctor. So he was picking glass out of people's backs. He found some boric acid and a little water, and it was a powder, and it turned out that was a very good thing for the burns. But they dealt with people there. Then they took a lot of them back to the novitiate with them and kept some of them for a year. So this was all part of his formation.
Yo creo que es fundamental. Yo comienzo mi biografía.
I think it's fundamental.
I begin my biography with the moment the bomb was dropped onto Hiroshima, and he's there below. In the burst, the spiritual explosion that is produced in him at the moment he stops and sees the watchtower stop at 8:15. The tremendous energy that results helps cure 150 sick who show up at his hospital thanks to a bottle of boric acid that he finds.
Assuredly, it was in such moments of tragedy that we felt God most near to us.
And this seems to have marked him very much. A kind of feeling of having been close to the end of the world, to have been present to one of the most dramatic events of the history of mankind. That remained with Arrupe, I think.
Ever after that, he could never stand violence. He'd say, violence, no, to be avoided no matter what the cost.
The 1960s erupt in a different kind of explosion. Social upheavals that alter the course of world events more extensively, perhaps, than even the atomic bomb. Ecclesiastical upheavals are triggered within the Catholic Church by the election of Pope John XXIII, who throws open church windows to the winds of change. His encyclical Pacem in Terris will address not just Catholics, but all men of goodwill, demonstrating fresh openness to the world. Only 90 days after his election, he unexpectedly invites all the bishops from around the globe to gather in Rome to re-examine the stance of the Catholic Church in a changing world. This 21st Ecumenical Council, the first in almost a century, becomes a major news event.
Considered one of the most important councils in Catholic Church history, Vatican II saw 2,400 bishops and other prelates in 168 sessions from October 1962. The council produced 16 documents designed to modernize the role of the Church in world affairs.
The council would meet in 4 sessions over 4 years. Its crowning document, the Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World, would address itself without hesitation not only to the sons and daughters of the Church and to all who invoke the name of Christ, but to the whole of humanity. The council's decrees will inspire and guide Pedro Arrupe as Jesuits become leaders in the implementation of the Church's modernization. Pope John XXIII dies before the council is completed and is succeeded by Pope Paul VI, who oversees the conclusion of the council. Shortly after the death of Pope John XXIII, the Superior General of the Jesuits, sometimes called the Black Pope, Father Janssens, also dies, and Jesuits from around the world gather to elect his successor. Among the gathering Jesuits was the president of Fordham University, Father Vincent O'Keefe.
In 1965, we had what we call a general congregation. This is our highest legislative body in the society. And so it's a meeting of Jesuits from all around the world, Jesuits who are elected in their own province to go to the big meeting in Rome.
Immersed in the spirit of the Second Vatican Council, Jesuits face their own challenges of change. Priorities need to be examined. Commitment to justice rises for special consideration. On the third ballot, the General Congregation elects Pedro Arrupe to be their Superior General on May 22, 1965, and goes on to pass wide-ranging reforms. Arrupe will be thrust unprepared into leadership that requires him to transform the ranks of nearly 30,000 Jesuits to address a new world order.
Father Arrupe's first official words as general were a quotation from Jeremiah. And it sounds strange, this is a man fluent in 7 languages. But when you read through the rest of the quotation, you realize that Pedro Arrupe is saying that he really doesn't know how to speak, but the Lord will talk for him, and the Lord will teach him how to speak. And he certainly did. He was a very articulate spokesman throughout his whole life. The heart and soul of that message was his basic option did not oppose the church to the world, but rather it considered the church in the world.
The message of spiritually engaging the world promoted by John XXIII and the Second Vatican Council, as well as by the Jesuit General Congregation, would nevertheless prove to be a challenge for Pedro Arrupe.
I accepted what the society gives to me, elected me as general, and the first things to come to my mind is a big cross. That is, I think I was bound to suffer in the rest of my life very much, because I suppose always a general has to suffer. But in this condition of the church, I think it's something special, which has tremendous changes, so many affections, so many problems, so much insecurity. But it's another aspect of to be a general, who is the source of great joy. And that is to have the possibility of knowing the society and the Jesuits from inside.
Arrupe will turn out to be an apt advocate of adapting the ministries of the Jesuits to the modern world. He is aware that finding God in all things and encountering Christ in the world are insights resulting from intense soul-searching on the part of Ignatius Loyola. As a novice master, he had immersed himself in the writings of the Jesuit founder. The profound spirituality he developed was based on the example of Loyola, whose passion was to discern the will of God in his life, a life that embraces the world he lives in. In 1965, the General Congregation that elects Arrupe concludes that the spirit of St. Ignatius calls for more active engagement in working for social justice. Arrupe enthusiastically embraces this direction, but not all Jesuits will be happy with it.
When he was elected General of the Society, it was just before the last session, the most decisive session of that Vatican II Council. And he got extremely interested. He felt that it was a turning point for the Catholic Church. The point which was decisive for him in the Council was the opening to the world. Particularly, I think, he felt that we had to look at the world around us in a new way.
Arrupe energetically embraces the message of the Second Vatican Council and the 31st General Congregation concerning the Church in the world.
He took the message from Rome. He went all over the world talking to Jesuits. He wanted to talk to Jesuits. But he was so personable, so knowledgeable, so convincing. It wasn't that he just made the vision credible, he made it infectious. That was the thing he had. He made it infectious.
It's such a richness today in the world, coming today to a new birth. We are in a very interesting moment of the history. Today we have a challenge that perhaps never had in society.
You can appreciate the tremendous dynamism in the church today. And that comes for the tremendous change, social change, technological change in the world.
We have to think about the tremendous problems of the world of today illuminated by faith. That is very interesting. The people have so many new problems. but no answers. Well, we have to be very careful to see what are the changes in the world, because that will mean for us also change of the service. But not only that, because also we are in middle of the world. Therefore, that supports for us a tremendous responsibility to adapt our spirituality to the real needs of today.
We have to heal the poor, or to help the third world, or we have to be much more international in our activity.
Christ is the Redeemer of the whole man, even materially. Therefore, we have to see how to combine, how to integrate the salvation of the whole man.
Today, what the world needs are people completely devoted, unselfish, working for the others.
I would say the Jesuits should be men of Amen and Alleluia. Amen is because to do always the will of God. And Alleluia because making the will of God, they should be very happy. And that is, I think, the motto of the Jesuits of today. Amen, Alleluia. I don't know.
Very good, very good.
Arrupe's ideal of Amen and Alleluia applies not just to Jesuits, but to lay people as well. His desire to see men and women working for others continues to shape faith and justice initiatives today, like the Jesuit Volunteer Corps and the Ignatian Volunteer Corps, and programs individually tailored for Jesuit University and high school campuses and parishes, each pursuing in its own way the service of faith and the promotion of justice.
This vision, which we can say is positive, will be transmitted externally to all. I think the messages of Father Arrupe go hand in hand with social justice, with globalization, with women's rights, with development, with the defense of human rights, with universal brotherhood, etc. Also to the youth, to believe in the youth as well.
The legacy of Pedro Arrupe lives on, most particularly in the Jesuit Refugee Service, the one service organization he personally initiated on an international basis. JRS began in response to the plight of Vietnamese boat people in the 1970s and serves an ever-growing wave of refugees today that numbers more than 40 million around the world.
He had come to an early conclusion, Arrupe, that if we were going to be coherent in our faith, we really had to promote justice. He'd seen injustice all over the world. He knew that the greater part of people in the world live in a state of utter poverty, and that poverty is eradicated in the systems. So he knew this, and he felt so strong. He was convinced that if we're going to have a coherent, one that's believable, apostolate, and a set of ministries, it has to include faith and justice.
You have to change because the world is changing, and then comes the ongoing formation, which is not just to have 2 weeks of theology, sometimes some books, some professors speaking of theology. No, it's much more than that. How to change the attitudes.
A lot of people are sort of uneasy with these changes. Wonder whether we've changed too much, gone too far.
His faithfulness to that 31st General Congregation has been one of the points of friction between Arrupe and at least a small section of the society, which went as far as a request to the Pope to get kind of separation of part of the Society of Jesus, which would remain allegedly faithful to the old way of life.
A disaffected group of European Jesuits were particularly unhappy about the new emphasis on social action and what they considered a downgrading of religious discipline and prayer. They proposed to the Vatican to break off from the Arrupe-led society to become so-called discalced Jesuits.
Paul VI was concerned about it and made an inquiry with the Spanish bishops, because that was mainly in Spain, as a matter of fact. And he asked the Spanish bishops, if I do accept that request, what happens, and so on. And I would say, thanks God, the Spanish bishops were wise enough to say that would be very dangerous, Holy Father.
But this would not be the end of it for Arrupe. Those Spanish Jesuits had deep ties in the hierarchical maze of the Vatican, and they would, in a sense, have the final word. Continuing to face resistance from some Jesuits who consider his emphasis on change and adaptation to be a personal agenda, Arrupe determines to convene another general congregation to either ratify or modify his priorities.
Arrupe, not alone, but advised by very many, came to the conclusion that he would need to call a 32nd General Congregation to bring together the major legislating body of the society to clarify a certain number of issues, to give him the support he needed in order to put into practice the decisions made before.
I am convinced that the society needs now a general congregation. It's a necessity. And I think it's no question for nobody in the society today to doubt about the long-lasting important matters we have to deal with. Difficult matters and pertaining to the whole society. Everything is new. And they have there a challenge for us. We oblige us to go to the bottom of our spirituality. But naturally, we have to stop and think and to reflect, to evaluate, and to see whether we are going the right path.
In 1975, the 32nd General Congregation issues the decree, Our Mission Today, the Service of Faith and the Promotion of Justice. The document is so hotly debated that it is not voted on until the last day of the meeting. When it finally passes with an overwhelming majority, it removes all doubts that Arrupe is on the right track.
And so one of the main things was articulating and promulgating a mission statement for our Society of Jesus today that would be in line with our original documents. But boy, it was a long time and a very difficult road we had to pursue to come to this. Probably the best expression we had of our Jesuit mission is the service of faith. That's what we're there for. But that service of faith has to include a promotion of that justice in society, which is the embodiment of God's love and saving mercy. You know, from our point of view of where we sat in Rome, Latin America was very receptive to his message because they were living in a poverty situation that was a grinding poverty that was real, and they felt it. And he said, no, this thing about faith and justice, he said, if we are serious about this, and it's not just something on the paper, we really have to pray, because this is going to be a radical change. And if we promulgate this, we are going to lose our friends. We are going to find opposition, both on the civilian level and on the ecclesiastical level. People are going to oppose us, they're going to persecute us, and some of us will be killed. Well, talk about the proverbial pin drop. In El Salvador, we had especially our Jesuit martyrs, and the 6 priests, remember, who was slain, and the head of them was a wonderful man named Ignacio Ellacuría, and a solid Basque who spoke very openly. And remember, they thought that they had shot them through the head and spilled their brains to show that this was an attack on the intellectual life and capacity of the country. That this is what they were going. That university represented the only active voice to a terrible government and a terrible group that was running the country.
In leading the Jesuits to engage a changing world, just Latin America that he has to contend with, Jesuits in Asia struggle anew with acculturation. In the United States, Jesuit Dan Berrigan is confronting public policies. Robert Drinan is an elected congressman to the great displeasure of conservative opponents. John McNeil is fueling culture wars with his book, The Church and the Homosexual. All of this is a source of inner turmoil for Arrupe as he attempts to discern the movement of the Holy Spirit in the change and conflict he is constantly called upon to mediate, including Vatican pressures to clamp down on what the Vatican saw as dissent. The policies of the general congregations that elected Pedro Arrupe in 1965 and later validated and advanced those policies in 1975 were still not well received by some Jesuits, some of whom had the ear of powerful cardinals in the Holy See. Relationships with the Vatican become increasingly complicated. Arrupe is unwaveringly loyal to the papacy, but he is crushed to learn that some Jesuits critical of him are finding favor in the corridors of the Vatican. Pope Paul VI, attempting a balancing act of his own in the wake of Vatican II, is someone Arrupe can talk with. But when John Paul II is elected in 1978, the relationship with the Vatican changes. By this time, a weary Arrupe believes that after almost 15 tumultuous years in office, it is time for new Jesuit leadership. He resolves to resign, and after consulting with his general assistants, determines to notify the Pope.
When Father Arrupe wanted to resign, he couldn't get the Pope to receive him. And when he finally did get an audience, it was really jammed in between two other audiences. So it lasted all of 13 minutes. And when Arrupe saw the Pope, he's always so deferential. He said, and when he mentioned design, the Pope's order, and the Pope said, where do I come into this? Well, it was rather blunt. And Arrupe was surprised. So he said, well, you're the superior. And then they went a little further, and he was looking at the memorandum, the Pope, and then he said to Arrupe, suppose I say no. Well, Arrupe said, well, what can I do? You're the superior. So at that point, the aides had come and they pulled him away. That was the end of the meeting. I think, the Pope, he didn't know what the results of his resignation would be. And he never wanted to deal with the unknown. So you didn't know who would be elected, so you couldn't tell what the outcome was going to be. And this Pope didn't want to go into anything where he could not already foresee the result. And whereas the Pope, John Paul II, had agreed to meet with Father Arrupe, to dialogue with him, and solve the problems around Father Arrupe's proposal to resign, the Pope simply wouldn't receive him in audience. That went on about 10 months. And when the Pope did see him, he said to Arrupe, this has been a good conversation, Father General, and I want to continue this with you. And Arrupe said, oh, I'd be delighted. Please, anything you want to know, call on me. Instead of calling on these other people, he was calling on other Jesuits, for example. Well, next month, May 13, that was the day of the assassination, so the Pope could no longer dialogue with Arrupe.
It would be months before the Pope recovers from the assassination attempt.
That was May of 1981, and in August of 1981, Arrupe was returning to Rome from a long trip that was especially to the Philippines. It was a long flight, and when they arrived in Rome at the airport, they noticed Arrupe was flushed, he was perspiring tremendously, and his language wasn't making much sense. So they rushed him into the car and rushed him right to the hospital named Salvator Mundi in Rome, where they had all of Arrupe's records. They saw right away it was a stroke. He had been able to speak, he was fluent in 7 languages. That disappeared. He understood the languages, but he couldn't speak them. All he could speak was a form of Spanish that was very difficult to understand, even for native Spanish speakers. So that stroke was a severe stroke. It really incapacitated him. We got out word to the whole society by cable, said he'd had this stroke. We didn't know the extent of it at the time, but as it turned out, it just, he was no longer able to go on.
With Arrupe struck down, the governance of the society falls to his vicar general, Father Vincent O'Keefe, which assures the continuity of Arrupe's vision and the election of a successor. This is not what Pope John Paul II has in mind, however. He does not want to risk a general congregation with the unknowns that implies. Within a few months, he appoints his own personal representative to assume leadership, Father Paolo Dezza. This direct intervention by the Pope in the governance of the Society of Jesus causes great consternation among Jesuits. They could not avoid the awareness that an earlier Pope, Clement XIV, had totally suppressed their society in 1773, a state of affairs that would last for more than 40 years.
The last few days of February and the early days of March of 1982, we had all the Jesuit provincials in Rome. Then the final day of that meeting, we had an audience with the Pope. Just a few months before, in October, we thought he might have been ready to tell the society, go on, you're finished, ready to dissolve the society. It was so bad. So between October and this February, something terrific happened. So now he gives us this terrific talk, which literally shocked us. It was so positive. He thanked the Jesuits. He thanked us, the general assistants, the beloved Father Arrupe, the revered Father Arrupe. And then he ran through a history of the society, which was incredible. So we said, what happened there? The Pope said to them, John Paul II said to Father Dezza, I had been led to believe that when my decision to appoint Dezza and Pitao became public, there would be open rebellion in the Society of Jesus. Superiors would leave, Jesuits would be running to the press, there would be chaos. He said, I had been led to believe that, and it never happened. Not a single person budged. Nobody left. So he said, those people were wrong. Father Arrupe was right. Father Arrupe said, the Jesuits will obey. You can tell him, the Jesuits will obey. Arrupe was right. He knew the Jesuits. John Paul II and the men he was counting on, they did not know the Jesuits. That was really a key moment in the whole thing. I had been led to believe. He had changed completely from really ready to condemn us, ready to suppress us again, to one now of extolling us, praising us, and hoping we would go on. I think the Arrupe period, that's 65 to 83, was a special time for our society. I think it was a blessed time. We had this wonderful man who was, as one man said, he's 100% St. Ignatius. He had this wonderful combination of a knowledge of and loyalty to the constitutions, the spiritual exercises before that, and then the writings of Ignatius. He was a man open to both the church and the world. In Spanish, amar y servir, love and serve. Love alone is not enough. That can be idealistic, dreamy. But you need service too. And service is not enough because it's much more than justice. It's a service that is motivated by love. So love and serve, that's it.
In his last conversation with a group of seminarians in Thailand, he said, "It's not what you say, but what you are." He communicated more by doing than by saying.
At the end he said, well, everything is love. That is the final basis of everything. Psychologically and and spiritually, and concerning the relationship of man to God himself, of God to man. We have to say everything is love, finally.
In spite of his disability, it's a joyous moment for Father Arrupe when he can embrace his successor chosen by the general congregation, Father Peter Hans Kolvenbach.
The stroke occurs on August the 7th of 1981. He has a period of silent suffering for 10 years, from 1981 to 1991. And at the end, he really couldn't speak. But as we said, he didn't have to, because his life said it all for him. And this is the quotation that really says it all. Nowadays, the world does not need words, but lives that cannot be explained except through faith and love for Christ's poor.
I hope you understand my poor English. I have to apologize, but anyway, I did try my best. Thank you very much.
May your grace make me whole again. May your eyes make me see again. May your words make me hear again your song of love. May your hands touch the poor again. May your arms hold the sick again. May your smile fill each heart